For more on this, I want to bring in former ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst. He's also senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. As of right now, talks are still ongoing between Russia, the U.S., and its European allies about de-escalation at the border with Ukraine. Let's go back to the basics and to the beginning, if you will. Remind us, why does Russia, or why would Russia want to invade Ukraine? And welcome.
Russia has two objectives. The immediate one is to make sure that Ukraine's foreign policy is dictated by Moscow, that Ukraine is unable to develop closer relations with the EU and with NATO. Its longer-term objectives is to change substantially its geopolitical position in Europe. It wants to remove all NATO forces from the NATO members that joined after the Cold War ended in the 1990s and the 2000s. And it's demanding those changes or threatening to invade Ukraine if it cannot get those changes.
I mean, and how much power of negotiation would Putin have in terms of this, of NATO's participation or presence in Europe?
It's really pretty simple. Russia has a formidable army on Ukraine's borders, and he could send that army into Ukraine, and that army could have temporary military success. But the United States and our NATO allies are far stronger than Russia in every possible way, economically, militarily, politically. And if we pursue a strong policy of telling Russia that we will take major steps that harm their interests if they send those troops into Ukraine, Putin will have no choice but not to invade Ukraine.
You know, several countries, including the U.S., have told the personnel in their embassy or the family members to leave Ukraine. But on Monday, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky told people in his country not to panic. Just give us a sense of what people inside Ukraine are facing right now, especially with this mixed messaging. What's the situation politically and socioeconomically?
Well, it's normal with the threat of war for foreign embassies to evacuate at least family members. So there's nothing strange about that. But Zelensky believes that Ukraine, which has already been fighting a war with Russia for almost 8 years, can manage additional Russian military action. I believe that Ukraine would be able to at least partly defend itself, but I believe even more firmly that if the Biden administration takes proactive, robust measures, if we send more weapons to Ukraine now, if we boost our forces in the eastern member NATO states now, and if we make clear to Moscow the heavy sanctions that we will impose on them, if they invade, Putin will likely not send additional troops into Ukraine.
Well, 100,000 is a lot. President Biden has said a Russian invasion of Ukraine would be the largest invasion since World War II. And he's also said that it would, quote, change the world. Do you agree with that? What does the president mean by that?
He's absolutely right. We have enjoyed, as the United States and the world has enjoyed, incredible security, stability, and prosperity since the end of the Cold War. If Putin invades Ukraine with a large military, that would be the biggest war in Europe, again, since World War II. It would mean that large countries can dictate to small countries what should happen. That would mean chaos. It would deeply hurt American interests because the next targets of Putin will be our NATO allies in the Baltic states, whom we must defend militarily. So America has a vital interest in helping Ukraine defeat Russia. This does not require American soldiers. It does require sanctions. It does require boosting NATO forces. It does require more American weapons for Ukraine. That is the smart play, which is very much in our interests.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that perhaps President Biden would put some troops on the ground. I know that President Biden has been saying that there's no plan to put American forces in Ukraine, but he has put thousands of troops on heightened alert. He has said that he'd enact some serious economic consequences or sanctions, as you mentioned earlier, and personally, too, on Vladimir Putin, directly on him. What do you make of the administration's handling of the situation to this point? And should it go further?
The administration's handling has been adequate, but not strong. All the things we've threatened are things that would happen after Putin invades Ukraine. We are not talking about sending American troops into Ukraine. We're talking about sending American troops now into our NATO allies near Russia's borders. That should happen now. That would tell Putin, even if he sends troops into Ukraine, his overall security will be worsened because of his aggression. We have to send additional arms to Ukraine now. They need missiles that can take out ships. They need missiles that can take out aircraft. We should provide them as defensive weapons. And we should make crystal clear what sanctions we will take if Putin does invade. All these things have to be stronger and more clearly stated by the United States.
Ambassador John Herbst, thank you so much for joining us
My
tonight.
pleasure.